It's worth putting the relationship in a historical perspective. We've gone through three 20-year cycles. Remember, in the 1950s, we were actually at war with each other. In the 1970s, after Nixon's meeting with Mao, we were basically cooperating and working together against the Soviet Union. From the 90s to the early 2010s, we had the period of engagement focused on economic engagement. And from the mid-2010s to today, we've begun a fourth cycle, which has been great power competition. And I think if you look at the previous cycles, we probably have another decade or so of that great power competition being the dominant feature of the relationship. But a great power competition doesn't have to be a zero-sum competition. I mean, there are some areas where the U.S. and China share common interests. The health of the global economy is a good example. Financial stability, and of course, the very important area of climate change, or dealing with pandemics, or preventing nuclear proliferation getting out of hand. So there are many things which are still areas of cooperation, even in a period of great power competition. And that's why I call the U.S.-China relationship a cooperative rivalry. We have to face the fact that the rivalry is there, but that doesn't prevent cooperation. The U.S.-Soviet nuclear rivalry, it took quite a while to develop rules of the road. And both countries engaged in an arms race, which led to higher levels of tension. We gradually developed practices of arms control and consultations. The U.S.-China nuclear rivalry isn't at the same high levels, so China is currently increasing its nuclear weapons. But I think there's a better realization in both the Washington and Beijing that it doesn't have to be equal numbers at high levels to have deterrence. Basically, if one or two nuclear weapons goes off in American city, that's enough to deter Americans. And similarly, I think it's true for China. And so the question then is, how do we develop rules of the road to manage that so it doesn't get out of hand? And so far, the U.S. and China have not done enough to try to develop such rules of the road. But I'm hoping that this may be one of the areas where we can indeed cooperate. I think we should look at the intentions or goals that the presidents have had, and then the means they've used, and then the consequences of their actions when we make an ethical judgment. I think if you look at the Biden administration, the goals are not to change China or overwhelm China. I think those goals are unrealistic and can lead to conflict. But as Secretary of State Blinken recently said, our goal is competitive coexistence. And that's something which can be beneficial to both China and the U.S. If you take the means that the U.S. has used, we have been careful not to get into direct confrontations, which involve force. And if you take the consequences, I think the consequences can be a period where both China and the U.S. can contribute to the world economy and develop internally, but avoid the kinds of dangers that could be disastrous for both of us and for the world as a whole. On the Trump administration, I find that he was often quite confused in stating his objectives or carrying them out. But I think Biden is doing a better job. It seems to me that the Biden response was correct, which was to say, if Putin uses military force, then we must collectively resist that military force. That starts with Ukraine, obviously, but others can provide assistance to Ukraine. So the assistance is both military assistance and sanctions on Russia. And the sanctions on Russia include the dollar sanctions that you mentioned. There is some danger that leads to a worry about de-dollarization. But I think when one looks at the status of the dollar as a reserve currency, even when other countries are trying to move away from the dollar, turns out there are not good opportunities to do so. So I think there is some risk of some degree of de-dollarization as a result of the sanctions, but it's not a severe danger, and it's worth running that degree of risk. When we talk about smart power, it means that soft power and hard power are not fully opposite to each other, but can reinforce each other. And in the case of Ukraine, you might say, well, isn't that pure hard power on both sides? But if you look at the fact that President Zelensky of Ukraine has appealed to his European neighbors and to the world community for support, that was an example of Zelensky's soft power, which translated into hard power of military assistance. So I would say the Ukraine war has been an example of Ukraine using smart power, both soft and hard. I think a hot war is not inevitable, and I think both Washington and Beijing have to be working very hard to make sure it never occurs. The U.S. is not an existential threat to China. China is too big to invade or to change domestically. And the same thing is true of China and the U.S. China can't invade or change the domestic politics of the U.S. So in that sense, we're not existential threats to each other unless we blunder into war. A major war would be devastating both to each of the two countries, no matter who won, and would also be devastating to the world economy. So that would be an existential threat. So that's why it's so important that we avoid it. It's true that Taiwan is a potential triggering point for miscalculations which could lead to such a war. But I think it's important to remember that President Biden has repeated the position that President Nixon took in 1972, which has lasted for 50 years, which we do not support the independence of Taiwan, and that we regard it's very important that the relations across the Taiwan Strait be settled peacefully. So in that sense, U.S. policy has not changed. And I think it's important that it not change. And Biden has talked about this, and the administration has said that the policy toward Taiwan has not changed. Now, the provision of military equipment to Taiwan, which goes back to the late 70s and early 80s under President Reagan, was to make sure that Taiwan had enough capacity to defend itself, that there was no temptation to use force rather than peaceful means to achieve the relations across the Taiwan Strait. So that aspect of the relationship with Taiwan, I think, will go on and should go on. But supporting Taiwan independence, I think, is a mistake and should not occur in the sense that we have agreed since 1972 to recognize a one China policy. I think to start with the demonization, it's a great mistake to demonize your competitor, because it means you don't have a clear head about when you compete and how you compete and when you can cooperate. So I've constantly opposed that. It's also true that it's harder to demonize your competitor if you know them, if you have human relations with them. And that's why I've been strongly in favor of people-to-people contacts, whether it's at the highest levels between President Xi and President Biden, or at the levels of Secretary of State, or at the levels of day-to-day working officials, but also at lower levels, including student exchanges or non-governmental exchanges. And there, I think there was already some deficit between the number of Chinese who are learning and understanding what America's strengths and weaknesses and faults were, and the number of Americans doing so. But it became much more difficult. The deficit was greatly increased by COVID. And that was a huge outside disruption, which greatly interfered with our ability to work together and cooperate with each other. I hope now in the post-COVID period, where COVID is more just an endemic type of threat like the flu, rather than the life-threatening pandemic that it was, I hope we'll see much more contact between middle and lower level aspects of China and US going in both directions. But let me give you one small silver lining from COVID, that despite the problems, there had been many contacts between Chinese scientists and American scientists. In the early days of COVID, before the governments made it more difficult, there's a great deal of exchange of scientific information between these groups which had worked together before the pandemic, which is very helpful in developing vaccines and eventually curbing the pandemic. So that's just an example of how these lower level people-to-people contacts can be so important, not just for avoiding demonization, but in enabling the two countries to cooperate in the areas where cooperation is so important.